If you're analyzing malware, your virtual machine isn't just a sandbox. It's your main workspace for safe, in-depth analysis. To do it right, you need an isolated environment loaded with tools for static, dynamic, and code analysis. My name is Anuj Soni, and after more than a decade reverse engineering malware and teaching thousands of analysts how to do it effectively, I'm going to show you how I build my ideal Windows 11 malware analysis lab. First, let's briefly talk hardware. You'll want a 64-bit system with an Intel or AMD processor and virtualization support enabled in your BIOS. I recommend at least 16 gigs of RAM so you can comfortably run a couple of virtual machines at once, and at least 60 gigs of free disk space. If you're on a Mac with Apple Silicon, those M-series chips, you can technically run Windows 11 ARM, but some malware analysis tools simply won't work properly, so if you want full compatibility, use an Intel or AMD system. Okay, for virtualization software, I still recommend VMware, which would be the Fusion product on Mac OS or the Workstation product on Windows or Linux. It's free for personal use. You'll just need to create a Broadcom account. Yes, you can use VirtualBox if you prefer, but in my experience, VMware, while not perfect, is just more stable, especially on a Mac, which is what I use for my host. Now let's move on to the guest operating system. Since support for Windows 10 has technically ended, it makes sense to build your lab using Windows 11 because that's what most enterprise environments are running or moving toward. There are 3 quick caveats I want to mention. First, you don't need a product key to complete the install. Just choose the option that says you don't have one. You can enter a key later or keep using Windows in an unactivated state. The only downside is that you'll see reminders to activate and you won't be able to personalize the environment, for example, by changing the desktop background. Second, instead of doing a clean install of Windows 11, you can upgrade your current Windows 10 VM, but you'll need to enable encryption for your VM, add a trusted platform module or TPM device, and expand your virtual disk size quite a bit. Even after doing that, honestly, I still ran into a few issues, so my recommendation is to start fresh with a new Windows 11 VM. It does take a little longer, but if your old VM hasn't been updated in a while, you're probably due for an update in your toolset anyway. Okay, the third caveat I want to mention is that during installation, Microsoft really tries to get you to use a Microsoft account instead of creating a local one, which isn't ideal for a malware analysis lab. Now, obviously, you don't want to log in with your personal Microsoft account since you don't want any malicious activity associated with that. So I think you really have 2 options. One is to simply create a throwaway Microsoft account just for the install, and then you can switch to a local account afterwards. Or 2, follow one of the guides I'll link to in the description that shows how to essentially trick the installer into thinking you don't have internet access, which will force Windows to give you the local account option. That approach worked for me, but Microsoft did hint at the fact that they might remove that workaround in the future, so I'm not sure how long that will be a viable approach. Now let's discuss some changes to make your lab more stable and predictable. First, we want to disable Windows updates. Now there are several ways to do this, but let me show you the way that I prefer. I'm going to go down here on my desktop to the Windows icon and right-click. I'll then choose Network Connections. I'm then going to click on Ethernet. And then you'll see an area called Metered Connection, and I'm simply going to toggle this to On. Setting the connection as metered prevents Windows from automatically downloading updates, including antivirus signature updates, which we'll talk more about shortly. Next, I suggest you modify User Account Control, or UAC. UAC prompts can interfere with the analysis process, so updating this setting ensures your tools and the malware run without interruptions. My preferred way of doing this is to go down to the Windows search, type UAC. There you'll see an option to change user account control settings. I'll click on that, and then I will simply drag this down to Never Notify, and then click OK. Once it asks if I want to confirm the change, I'll click Yes, and then I should no longer receive those prompts. Okay, and the most important security setting we want to modify is disabling Windows Defender, so samples aren't quarantined while you analyze them. In my experience, this can require a bit of trial and error, so rather than discuss all the possible commands and configuration options here, you can go to the link in the description and I will email you a summary document with those details, as well as a complete list of all the tools I recommend installing with the appropriate links. Oh, and one more thing. It is a good idea to update File Explorer to show file extensions. By default, these are hidden, but you can change them by going to the File Explorer, which I'll click on now, and then I'll go to View, Show, File Name Extensions. And from that point forward, all files will have an extension associated with them. And now let's discuss analysis tools. Quick note first, Flare VM is a popular choice for getting a malware lab set up quickly, and you're obviously welcome to use it if you like. But I do think there's value in installing tools yourself. Just as we reverse engineers aim to understand other programs, it's equally valuable to understand the tools we rely on. And installing and configuring your own tools reinforces that and also puts you in a better position to troubleshoot if something does break. Okay, so first, some general utilities to consider installing. Python for scripting and running some tools, 7-zip for creating and extracting archives, including password-protected malware. You'll also want a capable text editor like Notepad++ or Sublime Text to take notes or make edits. And finally, for performing encoding, decoding, and other transformations on data, I highly recommend downloading CyberChef into your virtual environment. Now let's discuss static analysis tools you would use to evaluate a file before executing it. I like to have a hex editor in my VM. There are obviously many options out there, but I prefer HXD, which is a simple hex editor that allows you to inspect and edit the raw bytes of a file. To help identify packed or obfuscated code, I use Detect It Easy and EXEinfo. For parsing the structure of a Windows executable file, there are a few tools I turn to with overlapping capabilities. And by the way, it's worth noting that using tools with overlapping capabilities is actually pretty important because one tool may identify characteristics that another misses. So I like PE Studio because it does a great job of highlighting potential red flags associated with a suspicious file. I also like PE Bear because it's very fast and handles malformed executables really well. CFF Explorer, which allows you to inspect and edit the headers and structures of Windows PE files, is another one that I turn to. One reason I really like it, even though it is a bit older, is because it displays the proper names of PE header fields as defined in Microsoft's specification, which I think helps you build a more precise understanding of the portable executable file format. As you may know, evaluating embedded strings is a basic step in the static file analysis process. So to extract that data, I like to use the sysinternal's strings64 utility, as well as Mandiant's floss capability for identifying not only plain text, but also obfuscated strings. And still talking about static file analysis, I use two rule engines to identify known suspicious or malicious patterns in my target file. I'll turn to Yara in combination with the Yara Forge rule set, and Mandiant's Kappa capability in combination with the Kappa rules available on GitHub. Next, let's turn to dynamic analysis tools you would use when executing a program to observe its behavior. First, we need a tool to monitor running programs. I use System Informer because it gives more visibility than the built-in task manager. It shows running processes, loaded modules, and even some live network activity. For more detailed insight into process activity, I turn to sysinternal's Process Monitor, also referred to as Procmon. This tool records file system, registry, and process activity. It has great filtering capabilities to sift through large volumes of data it collects, and it can also produce a process tree of historical activity. If I just want an overview of registry and file system changes, Redshot is the tool I recommend. You can use the tool to take a snapshot of the registry and file system before and after you run a sample to quickly identify persistence techniques and other impacts of execution. All right, we're still talking about dynamic analysis, and for network analysis, I rely on two tools. The first one is FakeNetNG, which allows you to intercept network traffic, and it simulates network services so you can see how malware attempts to communicate without needing a real internet connection. And for deeper analysis of command and control communications, I turn to Wireshark, which of course is commonly used for capturing and inspecting network traffic. Let's now move on to code analysis tools. Now, when it comes to debugging, where you execute a program in a very controlled way and can pause it at different points to see what's happening in memory, my go-to tool is X64Debug. I also install 3 plugins that make the debugging experience much more effective. The first is OllyDumpX, which helps dump unpacked or deobfuscated code to disk. The second is Silahide, which helps bypass common anti-debugging techniques. And finally, the third plugin I use is Xanalyzer, which adds helpful annotations and insights as you step through code. For static code analysis, where you review code without running it, my current choice is Binary Ninja, but of course other great alternatives exist as well, such as Ghidra or IDA. Finally, let's cover 2 automated analysis tools that I think are pretty important to have on hand. I do want to clarify that these tools support but not replace your hands-on analysis. But the first tool I want to mention is Speakeasy. Speakeasy emulates Windows code so you can analyze executables, DLLs, even shellcode without fully running them in the operating system. This can be useful for quickly observing behavior and extracting IOCs in a very controlled environment, but keep in mind, any emulation environment has limitations, so don't expect any and all code to just run perfectly. And second, for help with dumping deobfuscated payloads from memory, I use malunpack. I've spoken in more detail about this capability before. Malunpack excels at passively identifying injected or unpacked code in memory, which is especially useful when dealing with multi-stage malware, which is pretty common today. So after setting up your VM with Windows 11 and installing the tools I just mentioned, the next step is to create a clone of your base VM. Both VMware Fusion and Workstation make this pretty easy to do. We do this because we want two separate VMs, one for static analysis and one for dynamic analysis. Your static VM will be used for inspecting files without executing them, while your dynamic VM will be used for safely executing samples and observing their behavior. This separation matters because during static analysis, we often take notes like adding comments in a disassembler or renaming functions, and you don't want that work to be impacted by malicious execution. It's also helpful to have a dedicated dynamic VM because it lets you iterate quickly while testing. You can run a sample, observe what it does, roll back to the clean snapshot, and then run it again, maybe under slightly different conditions. After cloning your base VM, rename one of them to Windows Static and the other perhaps to Windows Dynamic or something similar. To make them easier to tell apart when you're actually using them, I also recommend changing the desktop background. If your Windows install is activated, you can do that in the personalization settings. I like to keep the static VM maybe a dark color like black and the dynamic VM something brighter. In my case, I typically use green. So that makes it clear what VM I'm always working in. Okay, let's finally talk networking modes. For the static VM, I recommend disabling the network adapter since it's not needed for file analysis. For the dynamic VM, the simplest option is host-only mode. This keeps your VM isolated from the internet, but it is worth noting that the dynamic VM can still then communicate with your host. So to stay safe, I recommend that you don't share any folders or drives between your host and VM, and make sure your host firewall is enabled. It also doesn't hurt if your host runs a different operating system. For example, I use an Intel Mac as my host. If you want an extra layer of safety, you can also create a custom isolated network that doesn't connect to the host at all. The steps to do this vary between VMware Fusion and Workstation, so I won't go into those specifics here, but you can easily find guidance online for your version. One thing to keep in mind, if you disable the network adapter entirely in your dynamic VM, tools like FakeNet and G may not work since they do require an active network interface to capture, so going with one of the other options I mentioned is probably best. And finally, take a snapshot of each VM once you're happy with the setup. I name mine static baseline for my static VM and dynamic baseline for my dynamic VM. Snapshots are especially important for the dynamic VM since that's where you'll be executing malware. And reverting those snapshots after each test helps you keep your environment consistent, clean, and ready for the next sample. And that's it. That's how I set up a Windows 11 malware analysis lab that's safe, stable, and ready for real-world samples. You can grab the full guide with tool links and configuration steps using the link in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.